The galaxy had forgotten about humans. 40,000 years had passed since Earth died. In that time, stars had been born, and stars had died. Empires had risen and fallen. New species had crawled out of their oceans, looked up at the sky, and built ships to carry them between worlds. The universe moved forward, as it always did, caring nothing for the small blue planet that once held 7 billion dreams. The conclave of aligned worlds now ruled the Orion arm of the galaxy. 17 different species worked together under one government. They had been doing this for 300,000 years. They knew how the universe worked. They had seen thousands of civilizations rise and fall. They had watched young species discover fire, then wheels, then nuclear power, then space travel. And they had watched most of those species destroy themselves before they ever left their home systems. Humans were just another name in a very long list. In the great archives of the conclave, humanity had a simple entry. Category 9. Self-terminated. Pre-expansion. This meant they had killed themselves before ever reaching other stars. The entry was short. It mentioned that humans had lived on the third planet from a yellow sun. It mentioned that they had been aggressive and creative. It mentioned that their sun had become unstable, and that the species had not survived. The entry was 1 paragraph long. There was nothing special about it. Velketh Sora had read that entry many times. She was an archivist, a keeper of records. Her job was to study dead civilizations. She belonged to a species called the Thalassians. They were tall and thin, with 6 arms and soft skin that glowed with gentle light. They lived for thousands of years and spent most of that time thinking and learning. Velketh Sora had been doing her job for 800 years. She had studied over 200 extinct species. She had seen every way a civilization could die: war, disease, asteroid impacts, climate collapse, self-destruction. Humans, she thought, were nothing special. Just another species that had burned too hot and too fast. Then the signal came. It arrived at a small listening station on the edge of known space. The station orbited a dead neutron star, spinning slowly in the darkness, catching whispers from the void. Most of what it caught was noise, random radiation from distant explosions, echoes of cosmic events that had happened millions of years ago. But sometimes, very rarely, it caught something else. The signal was weak. It had traveled for 40,000 years across empty space. It had crossed distances that made the mind hurt to think about. By the time it reached the station, it was barely a whisper. But it was not random noise. It was organized. It had structure. It had meaning. Someone had sent it on purpose. The station's caretaker, a small mechanical being with limited intelligence, flagged the signal and sent it to the conclave for analysis. It passed through 17 different departments before it landed on Velketh Sora's desk. No one expected anything important. Signals from dead civilizations were usually simple things: distress calls that no one had answered, warnings about dangers that had long since passed, mathematical proofs meant to show other species that intelligent life existed. Velketh Sora began her analysis on a quiet morning. The light from a distant red star filled her office with warm color. She connected to the signal and began to decode it. The first layer was mathematics. This was normal. All civilizations used math to communicate because math was universal. 2 + 2 = 4 everywhere in the universe. She translated the mathematical sequences quickly. They were simple, almost childlike. She felt a little disappointed. Then she found the second layer. Under the mathematics, there was music. Velketh Sora stopped. She ran the analysis again. Yes, there was music. Actual music. Encoded in the signal. Sound waves converted to data. Preserved for 40,000 years, now playing in her office like ghosts singing from the grave. She did not recognize the instruments. She did not understand the words. But something in the melody made her hearts beat faster. Something in the rising and falling notes made her feel an emotion she could not name. It was sad and hopeful at the same time. It was the sound of someone reaching out across an impossible distance, hoping that someone, somewhere, would hear. She kept digging. Under the music, there was more. So much more. The signal was not simple at all. It was a container. A vessel carrying something precious. And as Velketh Sora opened layer after layer, she began to understand what the humans had done. They had sent everything. The probe that carried this signal had been launched from Earth in its final years. The humans had known they were going to die. Their sun was failing, and they did not have the technology to escape. They had no ships that could carry them to other stars. They had no way to save their bodies. So they saved their minds instead. Velketh Sora found books. Millions of books. Stories and histories, science and poetry. Written in hundreds of different languages. She found images. Paintings that humans had created with their hands. Photographs that captured moments of their lives. Maps of their world drawn when they still thought the world would last forever. She found their science. Messy and incomplete. Full of wrong turns and failed experiments. But also full of brilliance. Ideas that sparkled. Like stars. Theories that the conclave had taken thousands of years to develop, sketched out by human minds in mere centuries. And she found their history. All of it, not just the good parts, the wars, the murders, the times they had hurt each other for no good reason. They had hidden nothing. They had sent their sins along with their songs. Velketh Sora worked through the night. She worked through the next day. She forgot to eat. She forgot to sleep. She could not stop. Every file she opened showed her something new. Every layer revealed another piece of a species that had refused to go quietly into the dark. By the third day, she had reached the final file. It was a video. Just one person. An old human woman standing on a cliff. Behind her, a gray ocean rolled against dark rocks. The sky was the color of bruises. The woman's face was lined and tired, but her eyes were bright. She looked directly at the camera. Directly at Velketh Sora. Directly at whoever might find this message in the distant, unimaginable future. And she spoke. "We know you are out there," the woman said. Her voice was soft but steady. "We will not make it. We know that now. Our sun is dying, and we cannot escape. But we wanted you to know something. We wanted you to know that we were here. We lived. We loved each other. We hurt each other. We made mistakes. We tried to fix them. We failed at many things. But we tried." The woman paused. The wind moved her gray hair. The ocean roared behind her. "If nothing else survives us," she said, "let it be known that we reached for you. We reached for you even though we knew we could never touch you. Because reaching out is what we do. It is what we have always done. It is all we know how to do." The video ended. Velketh Sora sat alone in her office, surrounded by the ghosts of 7 billion people. And she wept. For 3 weeks, Velketh Sora did not leave her office. She ate only when her body forced her to. She slept only when her eyes refused to stay open. Every moment that she was awake, she spent inside the human archive, swimming through the memories of a dead world. The probe that the humans had sent was small. It was no bigger than a transport vehicle. But they had packed it with more information than seemed possible. They had compressed their entire civilization into a metal shell and thrown it into the darkness like a message in a bottle. And what a message it was. Velketh Sora started with the music. There were billions of songs. Ancient songs played on wooden instruments. Modern songs created by machines. Songs of love and songs of war. Songs that made her want to dance, even though Thalassians did not dance. Songs that made her cry, even though she did not understand the words. She learned that humans had used music for everything. They sang when they were happy. They sang when they were sad. They sang to their children to help them sleep. They sang to their dead to help them rest. They sang to their gods, even though they could not agree on which gods were real. Music was woven into every part of their lives, like blood flowing through a body. One song stayed with her more than the others. It was old, very old, created by a human named Beethoven, hundreds of years before the collapse. He had been losing his hearing when he wrote it. He was going deaf, and he knew he would never hear his own music again, but he wrote it anyway. It was called the Ninth Symphony, and it was about joy. Velketh Sora played it again and again. A deaf man writing about joy. A dying species sending it to the stars. There was something in that combination that she could not put into words. She moved on to the art. The humans had created so much art that it would take a lifetime to see it all. They had painted pictures on cave walls before they had built houses. They had carved statues out of stone. They had captured light itself and turned it into images. They had built buildings that served no purpose except to be beautiful. She found a painting of a woman smiling. It was not a perfect painting. The colors were faded. The woman was not the most beautiful human she had seen in the archives. But something about the smile was alive. It felt like the woman was about to laugh at a secret joke. Velketh Sora stared at that smile for an hour, trying to understand how a dead artist could make paint feel alive. She found photographs of sunsets. The humans had been obsessed with sunsets. They took millions of pictures of their sun going down behind their oceans and mountains and cities. The images were all the same and all different. Every sunset was unique, and every sunset meant the same thing. Another day ending. Another reminder that time was passing. Another moment of beauty before the darkness came. The humans had known their sunsets were numbered, and they had saved as many as they could. The science files were harder to understand. Velketh Sora was not a scientist, but she could see that the humans had been brilliant in strange ways. They did not think like the conclave species thought. Their ideas were messy and wild. They made huge leaps without checking their work. They guessed when they should have calculated. They tried things that should not have worked, and sometimes those things worked anyway. She found a file about something called the moon landing. The humans had sent members of their species to their planet's moon. This was not impressive by itself. Many species had done the same thing. But the humans had done it only 60 years after they first learned to fly. They had gone from wooden aircraft to walking on another world in a single lifetime. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was the kind of thing that should have ended in disaster. But they had done it anyway. Because reaching out was what they did. The history files were the hardest to read. Velketh Sora had studied extinct civilizations for 800 years. She knew that intelligent species could be cruel. She had seen records of wars and genocides from dozens of different worlds. But something about the human cruelty hit different. Maybe it was because she had heard their music first. Maybe it was because she had seen their art. She knew now that humans were capable of creating beautiful things. And that made it harder to understand how they could also create such horror. They had killed each other over land. They had killed each other over ideas. They had killed each other over the color of their skin, which seemed insane because they were all the same species. They had built weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single flash. They had used those weapons, twice, but they had also tried to be better. She found records of humans fighting to free other humans from slavery. She found records of humans protecting strangers during wars. She found records of humans building hospitals and schools in places they had once bombed. It was like they were at war with themselves, their better nature fighting their worse nature for control of their souls. And in the end, when the sun began to die, their better nature had won. The final years were recorded in detail. The scientists had discovered the problem first. Something was wrong with the sun. It was not going to burn out slowly over billions of years like it should. Something had destabilized it. They had maybe 300 years. Velketh Sora read about the panic, the denial, the riots, the governments that fell, the wars that almost started. She read about the human leaders who tried to escape alone, building secret ships for themselves while millions starved. But she also read about what happened next. Slowly, painfully, the humans had come together. Not all of them. There were holdouts and fanatics until the very end. But most of them looked at the situation and made a choice. They could spend their final centuries fighting over scraps, or they could do something else. They chose something else. The probe was built by every nation working together. The archive was filled by scientists and artists, and ordinary people from every corner of the planet. They argued about what to include. They fought about what was important, but they kept working. For 300 years, generation after generation, they built their message in a bottle. The old woman in the final video was the last survivor of the team that had started the project. She had been born after the announcement. She had spent her entire life knowing that her world was going to end, and she had spent that life helping to create something that would outlast the end. Velketh Sora watched her video again. She looked at the woman's tired eyes and steady voice. She listened to the words, "We reached for you even though we knew we could never touch you." This was what made humans different, not their intelligence. Other species were smarter, not their technology. Other species were more advanced, not their bodies. Other species were stronger and faster and better adapted. It was their refusal to give up. Their stubborn, irrational hope. Their desperate need to connect with something beyond themselves. They had known they were going to die. They had known that no one would save them. And instead of curling up and waiting for the end, they had spent 300 years reaching out to strangers they would never meet. Velketh Sora closed the files. She sat alone in the darkness of her office. Surrounded by the light of distant stars, she had studied 200 extinct civilizations. She had never cried for any of them, but she cried for humanity. She cried for the old woman on the cliff. She cried for the deaf man who wrote about joy. She cried for the 7 billion souls who had refused to let death be the final word. And then she made a decision. The galaxy needed to hear this. The conclave needed to know what humanity had done. This could not stay buried in an archive, read only by scholars. This was too important. She began preparing her report for the High Conclave. She did not know what they would do with the information, but she knew that she had to share it. The humans had sent their message across 40,000 years of darkness, hoping that someone would listen. The least she could do was make sure someone did. The High Conclave met in a chamber that was older than most civilizations. It had been carved into the heart of a dead moon orbiting a gas giant the size of 1,000 Earths. The walls were made of crystal that had formed over millions of years. The ceiling showed the stars themselves, visible through a dome of transparent metal. Here, the leaders of 17 species came together to decide the fate of the galaxy. Velketh Sora stood alone in the center of the chamber, surrounded by beings she had only read about in histories. There was High Arbiter Molndal, the oldest member of the conclave. He was not organic. His species had long ago transferred their minds into crystal bodies that could survive for millions of years. He glowed with cold blue light, and his voice sounded like wind moving through glass. There was General Vrix of the Kavith Collective. Her species were warriors, bred for combat over hundreds of thousands of years. She had 4 arms and skin like stone, and her eyes tracked Velketh Sora with the patience of a predator. There were the Singers of the Void, beings of pure energy who communicated in mathematical harmonics. There were the Builders of Stations, massive creatures who lived in space and never touched planetary surfaces. There were representatives from species that breathed methane, species that thought as hive minds, species that experienced time differently than others, and all of them were looking at her. Velketh Sora had presented her findings. She had played the music, she had shown the art, she had displayed the science. She had let them watch the old woman on the cliff deliver her final message. Now she waited for their response. The silence stretched for a long time. In the conclave, silence was meaningful. It meant that the members were thinking. It meant that they were uncertain, and in a body that had governed the galaxy for 300,000 years, uncertainty was rare. High Arbiter Molndal spoke first. "This is troubling," he said. His voice echoed through the crystal chamber. Very troubling. Velketh Sora felt her stomach drop. She had expected many reactions. Wonder, perhaps. Curiosity. Maybe even joy at discovering something new about the universe. She had not expected trouble. "Troubling?" she asked. "In what way, High Arbiter?" "You have studied extinct civilizations for centuries," Molndal said. "You know the patterns. Aggressive species destroy themselves. It is natural law. Species that are ambitious and creative, species that expand quickly and fight constantly, they burn themselves out. They always do. This is why the conclave has survived for so long. We are patient. We are careful. We do not rush. The humans were different, Velketh Sora said. They were aggressive and creative. Yes. But in the end, they came together. They chose to reach out instead of destroy. And that is what troubles us, said General Vrix. Her voice was deep and rough. The model says that species like humans destroy themselves. The model has been accurate for 300,000 years. If the model is wrong about humans, what else is it wrong about? Velketh Sora began to understand. The conclave was not impressed by humanity's final gift. The conclave was afraid of it. For 300,000 years, the conclave had maintained order through a simple belief. Dangerous species were self-limiting. You did not need to fight them or control them. You just needed to wait. Eventually, they would destroy themselves, and the patient species would inherit what remained. This belief was the foundation of everything the conclave did. It was why they did not interfere with young civilizations. It was why they did not share advanced technology. It was why they watched and waited instead of acting. But the humans had broken the pattern. What would you have us do? Velketh Sora asked. The humans are dead. They have been dead for 40,000 years. There is nothing to fear from them. It is not the humans we fear, Mondal said. It is what they represent. If word of this spreads, other species will hear about it. Young species, aggressive species, species that we have been waiting to burn themselves out. They will hear that a dangerous species can choose to be better. Vrix added, they will hear that aggression is not a death sentence. They will hope, and hope is dangerous. Velketh Sora felt cold anger rising in her chest. So you want to bury this? You want to hide what the humans did? We want to protect the order that has kept the galaxy stable for longer than your species has existed, Molndal said. The archive will be sealed. The signal will be classified. You will return to your work and speak of this to no one. The humans sent that message to be heard, Velketh Sora said. Her voice was louder now. She could not stop herself. They spent 300 years building it. They died hoping that someone would listen. You cannot silence them. We can, Vrix said simply. And we will. The singers of the void hummed in agreement. The builders of stations shifted their massive bodies. One by one, the members of the conclave signaled their support for the decision. The archive would be sealed. Humanity's final gift would be buried in darkness. Velketh Sora stood alone in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy. And she felt something she had never felt before. Rage. She had spent 800 years as a quiet scholar. She had never broken a rule. She had never questioned the conclave. She had believed in the system because the system had seemed wise and good, but now she saw the truth. The system was not wise. It was afraid. It had maintained order, not through justice but through control. And when something challenged that control, even something beautiful, even something that could make the galaxy better, the system's only response was to crush it. She thought about the old woman on the cliff. She thought about the deaf man who wrote about joy. She thought about 7 billion people who had refused to let death be the end. They had reached out across 40,000 years, hoping that someone would catch their message. And she had caught it. I understand, Velketh Sora said quietly. I will return to my work. Molndal's crystal body pulsed with satisfaction. You are wise to accept this decision. The order must be preserved. Velketh Sora bowed and left the chamber. She walked through the ancient corridors of the dead moon, past guards and officials and other scholars who had no idea what had just happened. She returned to her ship and flew back to her office at the edge of known space. And then, in the quiet of the night cycle, she made her choice. The conclave had access to every communication network in the galaxy, but Velketh Sora had spent 800 years studying signals. She knew how the networks worked. She knew their weaknesses. She knew how to reach places that the conclave thought were secure. She copied the human archive. All of it. Every song. Every painting. Every book. Every video. She compressed it into a signal that could travel on 1,000 different frequencies. And she broadcast it everywhere. She sent it to universities on the core worlds. She sent it to temples on the pilgrim planets. She sent it to warships and trading vessels and remote colonies that had not heard from the conclave in generations. She sent it to young species who had just discovered radio and ancient species who communicated through gravity waves. She sent it to everyone. By the time the conclave realized what was happening, it was too late. The signal was everywhere. It could not be stopped. It could not be contained. It spread like light itself, touching every corner of the galaxy. Humanity's final message had been heard. Velketh Sora sat in her office and watched the confirmations arrive. Thousands of worlds were receiving the signal. Millions of beings were hearing the music, seeing the art, watching the old woman on the cliff. She knew what would happen next. The conclave would come for her. She would be arrested. She would probably be killed. Or worse, imprisoned in some dark place, where she would never see the stars again. But she did not care. The humans had reached out across 40,000 years of darkness, hoping that someone would listen. They had died believing that the message mattered more than the messenger. She understood now. She understood what they had known all along. Some things were worth more than survival. The conclave's ships arrived 3 hours later. Velketh Sora did not resist. She let them take her away, her skin still glowing with soft light, her heart still beating with something that felt like hope. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was listening to humanity's song, and nothing would ever be the same. The signal spread like fire through dry grass. Within hours, it had reached the core worlds of the conclave. Within days, it had touched the outer colonies. Within weeks, there was not a single corner of the galaxy that had not heard the music, seen the art, or watched the old woman deliver her final words. The conclave tried to stop it. They jammed frequencies. They arrested those who shared the files. They declared the signal dangerous, a threat to public order, a virus that needed to be contained. It did not matter. The signal was everywhere now. It had been copied 1,000,000 times. It lived on private servers and hidden networks, and the personal devices of beings across 1,000 worlds. Every time the conclave destroyed one copy, 10 more appeared, and something strange began to happen. On Thessar 7, a world in the outer spiral arm, 2 religious groups had been at war for 800 years. The conflict had started over a disagreement about the nature of the divine. Over the centuries, it had become something else entirely. Now they fought because their parents had fought, and their grandparents before that. No one remembered the original cause. The hate had become its own reason. A young soldier named Kethra was guarding a checkpoint when she first heard the music. Another soldier had been playing it on a small device, hidden from the officers who would have confiscated it. The sound drifted across the broken street, past the burned buildings and the bodies that no one had bothered to bury. It was the 9th Symphony. The one written by the deaf man, about joy. Kethra had never heard anything like it. Her species did not create music the same way. Their songs were functional, used for communication and coordination. They did not make sounds just because the sounds were beautiful, but this was beautiful. She did not understand how or why, but she felt something unlock inside her chest. Something she had not felt since she was a child. Before the war had taken everything soft from her, she asked the other soldier what it was. He told her about the signal, about the humans, about the dead world, and the message that had traveled 40,000 years to reach them. That night, Kethra crossed the battle lines. She found an enemy soldier and played the music for him. He did not attack. He did not call for backup. He just listened. By morning, both armies had stopped fighting. Not forever, not everywhere. But enough soldiers had heard the music and felt what Kethra had felt. Enough of them were tired of killing for reasons they did not understand. They put down their weapons and sat together in the ruins, listening to songs from a world that no longer existed. The war on Thessar 7 did not end that day. But something cracked. Something that had seemed permanent and unbreakable suddenly seemed fragile. And over the following years, piece by piece, the crack spread until the whole structure of hate collapsed. Similar stories happened across the galaxy. On the Forge moons of the Kaveth Collective, engineers had been struggling with a problem for generations. They needed a more efficient way to transfer energy across long distances. The current methods worked, but they wasted too much power. The collective had thrown their best minds at the problem for centuries without success. Then someone found the human science files. The humans had not solved the problem either. They had died before they could finish their research. But in the messy notes of a human scientist named Elena, there was a strange idea. A guess, really. A wild theory that she had scribbled down one night and never had time to test. What if we tried it this way? The Kaveth engineers looked at the theory. It should not have worked. It broke several rules that they had considered fundamental laws of physics. But there was something about it that felt right. Something about the way the human mind had approached the problem from an angle that no Kaveth would have considered. They tested it. It worked. Within a decade, the new energy transfer technology had spread across the collective. Within a century, it had reached the rest of the galaxy. Ships could travel faster. Stations could support more life. Worlds that had been too far from stars to support colonies suddenly became livable. The human scientist Elena had been dead for 40,000 years. But her wild guess, her untested theory, her what-if, had changed the shape of civilization. On the Pilgrim worlds, the effect was different. These were worlds dedicated to spiritual contemplation. Billions of beings came here to seek meaning, to connect with something greater than themselves, to find answers to questions that had no answers. The temples and monasteries had stood for hundreds of thousands of years. The rituals had been the same for so long that no one questioned them anymore. Then the pilgrims heard the old woman's message. We loved. We failed. We tried. It was so simple. So honest. The humans had not claimed to have the answers. They had not pretended to understand the meaning of existence. They had simply said what was true. They had lived. They had tried their best. And in the end, they had reached out to strangers they would never meet, hoping that their reaching would matter. The priests and monks who had spent their lives seeking perfect wisdom suddenly felt very small. They had complicated something that the humans had understood simply. Connection was not about having answers. It was about asking questions together. Young pilgrims began to leave the temples, not to abandon their faith, but to live it differently. They went out into the galaxy to help others, to build things, to reach out the way the humans had reached out. The old rituals continued, but they meant something new now. They were not about escaping the world. They were about embracing it. The conclave watched all of this with growing horror. Their model of the universe was breaking. The order they had maintained for 300,000 years was cracking at the edges. Species that had been content to wait were now acting. Ideas that had been stable were now changing. The careful balance that had kept the galaxy peaceful was shifting in ways that no one could predict. They arrested Velkath-Sora and brought her before the High Conclave for trial. She stood in the same crystal chamber where she had first presented her findings. The same beings looked down at her. But something had changed. She could see it in their postures, hear it in their voices. They were afraid. You have caused chaos, Mondal said. His crystal body flickered with unstable light. Wars are ending. Religions are changing. Technologies are advancing faster than we can track. The order is collapsing. Good, Velkath-Sora said. The word echoed through the chamber. No one had ever spoken to the High Conclave that way. Your order was built on fear, she continued. You kept the galaxy stable by making sure nothing ever changed. You watched young species struggle and die because you believed that dangerous things would destroy themselves if you just waited long enough. But the humans proved you wrong. They were dangerous and creative and aggressive, and they chose to be better. They chose to reach out instead of destroy, and now others are following their example. Vrix growled. Species that should be destroying themselves are instead working together. The model is broken. The model was always broken, Velkath-Sora said. You just refused to see it. You were so afraid of change that you made stability into a prison. But the humans did not want stability. They wanted connection. And now the whole galaxy wants the same thing. She looked at the ancient beings around her. They had ruled for 300,000 years. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had considered themselves the wisest creatures in existence. But they had been wrong about humans, and that meant they might be wrong about everything else too. "You can kill me," Velketh Sora said. "You can try to suppress the signal. You can fight against the change that is coming, but you will fail, because the humans taught us something that you never understood." She paused. The chamber was silent. Every being was listening. "Reaching out matters," she said. "Even when you cannot touch what you are reaching for. Even when you know you will fail. The reaching itself is the point." That is what the humans knew. That is what they died trying to tell us. And now the whole galaxy has heard their message. The trial ended without a verdict. The conclave could not agree on what to do with her. Some wanted her executed. Others, younger voices that had grown louder in recent months, wanted her released. In the end, they simply let her go. There was no point in punishing her. The damage, if it could be called damage, was done. Velketh Sora returned to her office at the edge of known space. She looked out at the stars and thought about the old woman on the cliff. She thought about the deaf man who wrote about joy. She thought about 7 billion people who had died 40,000 years ago but whose voices were now being heard across the galaxy. Something new was beginning. She did not know what it would become. But for the first time in her 800 years of life, she felt something that she had only read about in the human archives. Hope. 1,000 years passed. In the long history of the galaxy, 1,000 years was nothing. Stars did not notice such a small amount of time. But civilizations did. And in those 1,000 years, everything changed. The conclave of aligned worlds no longer existed. It had not fallen in war or collapsed in revolution. It had simply become unnecessary. The rigid structure that had governed the galaxy for 300,000 years had been replaced by something looser, something wilder. Something that would have terrified the old High Arbiters if they had lived to see it. They called it the Ember Accord. The name came from a human phrase that had been found in the archive. Someone had written that hope was like an ember. It looked small and weak, easy to ignore, easy to crush. But if you protected it, if you fed it, if you believed in it, that tiny ember could grow into a fire that warmed the whole world. The Ember Accord was built on principles that the old conclave would have considered dangerous. Member species were encouraged to change, to grow, to take risks. Young civilizations were given technology and knowledge instead of being left to struggle alone. Conflict was addressed directly instead of being allowed to burn itself out. It was messy. It was chaotic. There were mistakes and failures, and moments when it seemed like the whole thing would collapse. But it did not collapse, because every time things got hard, someone would remember the human message. Someone would remember the old woman on the cliff. We loved, we failed, we tried. That simple statement had become a kind of prayer across the galaxy. It was carved into monuments and whispered in temples, and taught to children as their first lesson about what it meant to be alive. The humans had given the galaxy permission to be imperfect. They had shown that failure was not the end, that trying mattered even when you did not succeed. And now, after 1,000 years, the Ember Accord was about to do something that would have seemed impossible in the time of the old conclave. They were going to bring humanity back. The project was called the Lazarus Initiative. It had been proposed by Velketh Sora herself, though she had not lived to see it begin. She had died 300 years after releasing the signal, her body finally giving out after 12 centuries of life. But her idea had survived her. The human archive contained genetic data. Not much. Just enough to reconstruct the basic blueprint of a human being. For centuries, the technology had not existed to do anything with this data. But as the species of the Ember Accord worked together, sharing knowledge and building on each other's discoveries, they had eventually learned how to read the blueprint. They could not clone humans. The data was too incomplete for that. But they could do something else. They could create new beings inspired by humanity, carrying the essence of the human genetic code while incorporating the gifts of other species. It was not resurrection. It was continuation. The project base was built on a small, rocky planet at the edge of explored space. The planet had a yellow sun, like Earth's. It had blue oceans and white clouds, and green growing things on its surface. The scientists who had chosen the location had searched for years to find a world that matched the images in the human archive. They wanted the new beings to wake up under a sky that felt like home. The first child was born on a quiet morning. She had been grown in a special chamber that combined human DNA with genetic material from 17 different species. She had the basic shape of a human. 2 arms, 2 legs, a face with 2 eyes and a mouth that could smile. But she was more than human too. From the Thalassians, she had received bioluminescent cells in her skin that glowed softly when she felt strong emotions. From the Kavath Collective, she had received bones that were stronger than steel, and muscles that could carry her across any terrain. From the Moldal, she had received a crystalline structure in her brain that could store memories for thousands of years. She was not human, but she carried humanity within her, like a flame carried in a lantern. They named her Ember. The scientists who had created her did not know what to expect. Would she be intelligent? Would she be kind? Would she understand what she was, what she represented, what she meant to the galaxy? They got their answer when she was 3 years old. Ember had been watching videos from the human archive. She loved the videos. She watched them over and over, studying the faces of beings who looked almost like her but not quite. She asked questions about them constantly. Who were they? Where did they go? Why could she not meet them? The scientists tried to explain. They told her about Earth and the dying sun. They told her about the probe and the message. They told her that the humans were gone but that she was their continuation, their legacy, their hope carried forward into the future. Ember listened carefully. She was quiet for a long time. Then, she asked a question that made the scientists cry. If they are gone, she said, then who will I reach for? It was such a human question. The humans had spent their final centuries reaching out to strangers they would never meet. It was built into their nature, this need to connect with something beyond themselves. And somehow, despite everything, that need had survived in Ember. You will reach for the same people they did, the lead scientist told her. Everyone. Anyone who is out there. Anyone who might be listening. Ember thought about this. Then she smiled. It was the same smile that Velketh Sora had seen in the painting from the human archive all those centuries ago. The smile that felt like it was hiding a secret joke. Then I will reach very far, Ember said. She was not the only child. Over the following decades, thousands more were born. Some looked more human than others. Some had wings. Some could breathe underwater. Some could survive in the vacuum of space. They were all different, but they all carried the same spark. They called themselves the Inheritors. They spread across the galaxy like their ancestors had once dreamed of doing. They built colonies on frozen moons and tropical worlds, and stations that floated in the hearts of nebulae. They became scientists and artists and explorers and teachers. They married beings from other species and had children who carried the human spark even further. And they never stopped reaching. 10,000 years after the signal was first received, the Inheritors numbered in the billions. They lived on 1,000 worlds. They had helped end wars and cure diseases and solve problems that had plagued the galaxy for ages. They had become exactly what the old woman on the cliff had hoped they would become. They were the proof that reaching out mattered. Then, in a listening station at the very edge of known space, a new signal was detected. It came from beyond the galaxy, from a place so far away that light itself took millions of years to make the journey. It was weak and fragmented, but it had the same structure as the human message, mathematics wrapped in something else, a pattern that could only have been created by intelligent minds. Someone out there was dying. Someone out there was reaching out across an impossible distance, hoping that someone, somewhere, would hear. The scientists who found the signal did not know what to do. They had never encountered anything like this before. They sent word to the Ember Accord, asking for guidance. The answer came from an inheritor named Sol. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Ember herself, now ancient beyond measure but still carrying the spark that had started everything. She read the report about the signal. She thought about her ancestor, the little girl who had asked who she would reach for. She thought about the old woman on the cliff, 41,000 years gone, whose words still echoed across the stars. Then she gave her answer. "We will respond," Saul said. "We will tell them that we hear them. We will tell them that they are not alone. We will tell them what the humans told us." She paused. Around her, the leaders of the Ember Accord waited to hear what came next. "We will tell them that we are reaching back." The response was sent that same day. It would take millions of years to arrive. The beings who had sent the original signal would almost certainly be dead by then. But that did not matter. What mattered was the reaching. Somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, a message was traveling toward strangers who would never be met. It carried music and art and science. It carried the best and worst of 100 different species. And it carried a simple truth that a dying world had discovered 41,000 years ago. We are here, we love, we fail, we try, and no matter how far away you are, no matter how long it takes, we will reach for you. Because reaching out is what we do. It is what we have always done. It is all we know how to do. And it is enough.